Good morning, Comp. Thanks for being
morning.
here.
It's great to be here.
Circus is back in
It's
town.
back. That's what I hear. And,
I love it.
When we're lucky, it's only 138 more days, but who's counting?
Come on. We would like them to be here
People like
every
me.
day, every single day.
Well, I hate to correct you when we start off, with all due respect.
Go ahead.
But fact is, yeah, you like them here, but only when there's drama.
I do want drama, and I was saying to you before we came up here that I'm already tired of the kumbaya moment. I want it to fade.
It's funny, after I laid out the revenue estimate on Monday, I had a whole bunch of interviews with some of your peers and colleagues in the press that day, the next day, and there was one constant theme. We're ready for the kumbaya to be over.
To be over.
Because we don't get many clicks and we don't get much reading when it's just calm.
I like my odds as far as that happening, so we'll see how it goes. So I thought we would start with the revenue estimate because although the people in this room tend to be elevated in their understanding of this stuff, I do think that for the masses, and I would actually put myself in the latter category because I look at this stuff and I go, well, it's a column of numbers. I want to understand more about it. I thought we would walk through the math.
That's great.
Just so we understand exactly what it is you loosed on the world on Monday, because it does have a significant effect as a backdrop for everything that we're going to do for the next.
The only thing they have to do is
That's
pass
right,
the budget.
pass the budget and go home. They won't do that, spoiler, but it is true indeed what they have to do. So here is the great graph. I just like your graphics. This is the great graphic from the Comptroller's website, which I'm going to use as a basis for this part of it. So we start out with general revenue tax collections, that number, which is $107.32 billion for 2020, 2021, or about $8 billion more than at the this time, beginning of the last session.
Right.
Is it unexpected or expected that there would be an increase of that much?
It was expected that there would be an increase, but as I gave a revised revenue estimate last July, which remarkably is the first time this office had given a new revenue estimate outside the day before a legislative session or a special session in 30 years. But the fact is the data was changing. The economy was stronger than we had anticipated.
Humming along.
Humming along very well. I mean, it's really remarkable, especially if you go back, let's use one data point. 2 years ago, if we were sitting here talking, we'd talk about job creation in the last 12 months, 170,000 jobs. Now, in the last 12 months, 60,000 jobs. I mean, essentially double. So that shows you the economy has improved significantly in the last 18 months. So we revised a revised revenue estimate. We knew the revenues were coming in stronger, but again, the economy, as I said on Monday, and I've said several times, it outperformed our expectations.
Well, you in fact said at one point on Monday that you expected sales taxes to slow in growth. The collection of sales taxes.
Earlier than they have.
Earlier than they have.
We were growing at double digits, essentially month after month. If you look when we closed the books at the end of last fiscal year, in August of last year, and opened the new fiscal year in September, last fiscal year was 10% higher in sales tax collections than it was the year before. I mean, that's unprecedented, strong growth.
And you're waiting for that good run of luck to run out.
Well, at one point, you're comparing yourselves to a new high. So as you're going here, you can't continue to be 10% higher. At some point, it's got to narrow back down to our norm, which is part of the point when I said the revenue estimate, and I will continue to say, yes, there's 8.1% growth in this revenue estimate compared to the one 2 years ago, which if you look at all revenue estimates prior to a legislative session in BREs, that's extremely high.
Right, and we'll come to that. Right.
However, with that being said, I wanted to caution significantly. But the math, if you go through the math, yes, the revenues are coming in higher for general revenue purposes, which is not the federal side, the state side.
Right.
And then as you go through the rest of it, you've got to reserve a little bit off to the side, which is a significant amount of money, $6-some-odd billion to make transfers over to our state economic stabilization fund.
So let's come to that because I want to just kind of get us to the 119 number and then back into a conversation about the component parts. So the 107.32 million is the number that we start out with. There's another 14 billion or so in other revenue, which is basically.
So
what is that?
Well, if you look at all the different revenues, there's the tax funds, there's other funds, which some of those are essentially fees that we have.
And this is effectively flat versus the last time we were having this conversation 2 years ago. It's about 14 billion.
Yeah, that's slightly flat.
So you get to 121.48 billion. Then the beginning balance this time is actually quite a bit higher, more than double what it was the last time, 4.18 billion. This is a carryover.
That's right.
This is like rollover minutes from the last time.
As long as they don't utilize a portion or all of that for a supplemental.
For a supplemental. And the expectation, Comptroller, is that there will be a pretty significant supplemental at the beginning of this session, do you think it will eat up the entire, based on what you know, will the supplemental eat up the entire $4.1 billion?
The question depends how much they may use out of the Economic Stabilization Fund to pay for Hurricane Harvey expenses and or anything else. So with that being said, my expectation is the supplemental could eat up that entire amount.
Right.
But I do not think it will eat up that entire amount because I think they'll use part of the ESF because all leadership has said that's an appropriate use.
So which is not to say that the amount that they're going to have to pay themselves back for would not exceed that amount, but they just may choose to use that amount for a portion of it,
That's right.
leave a portion of it there as active money, and then go into the ESF for the balance.
That's right.
Have you been able to estimate what you think the state's going to be on the hook for Harvey?
A number that I've consistently used is around $1 billion, but then again, a portion of that is policymaker decisions, and a large portion of that is going to public education in the schools for those that had impacts and damage. Those were Chapter 41, for lack of better ways to say it, or your so-called wealthier school districts that pay money into the overall system so money can be equalized elsewhere throughout the state. Those school districts are able to retain those dollars. So there's a whole bunch of different moving parts as schools are damaged and use that money to backfill for their repairs. And so part of it ends up being the lawmakers can go above those thresholds in law if they so choose.
Right.
So that's where the question mark begins, as in how far do they want to go. But I continue to use $1 billion because I just think that's a convenient kind of round place mark.
So you take that billion and everything else that was kicked down, a can of sorts kicked down the road from the last session, so they'll eat up a portion of, if not all of that overage, and then also dip into the rainy days. And then you get to $125.67 billion. But then you've got, as you alluded to, a transfer out of that number into the rainy day fund, economic stabilization, and for the state highway funds of $6.34 billion, slightly higher than last time.
Right. So those are our severance tax collections.
Right.
75% of our severance tax collections above 2 thresholds.
And the voters said grace on this scheme 1 or 2 sessions
Yeah,
ago.
we did. Well, part of it was back in the 1980s when it was created, the state savings account, and then the other part of it was a few sessions ago whenever we decided, oh, we got a lot of money in the state savings account. Why don't we put part of it to transportation?
Right.
I mean, I don't know if any of y'all been stuck in traffic lately. I have.
Yeah.
Like every day as I travel around the state. So the decision was to send some over there. So now it's essentially, instead of all of that 75% going in the state savings account, it's 37.5
Right.
or 37.5.
And you've probably heard walking along Congress Avenue the same bitching about that as I have over the last couple. Well, look, we made the decision to do this, and on paper it was a good idea, but what we've basically done is tied our hands here at the beginning of a session and committed to this, and all we're really doing is taking a haircut at the beginning of the budget cycle. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all. Do you have a point of view about that?
Well, I think it's really important to take the state's collections from severance taxes, and I think it was a very wise decision many years ago. Not though I think anyone that was here really believed the state savings account was going to have a whole lot of money.
As much as it does, certainly.
Because the reality is, you know, we thought that oil was finished, it was done in Texas. No one saw what was coming decades later with fracking capabilities and shale here in Texas. So now you have the Permian Basin, the most prolific growth of any basin around the world, not just the U.S. No one foresaw that in the 80s. And so I think they created this hope, wish, pray, it'll have a little bit of money, and then starting around 2006, you start having significant amounts of money put into it.
But I guess the question is less about the ESF than it is about this idea that we have put ourselves in handcuffs in a way on taking this money out and putting it toward transportation. And that's where the complaining occasionally you will hear. Well, we've kind of we've put ourselves in a disadvantageous position heading into every budget cycle, committed to moving this money out, not being able to use it for other things. Do you have any reason to think that was not a good idea?
I would think having a portion of this going to transportation is extremely important because, as I noted, this fund has $12 billion in it.
And you said at the end of the next biennium, it'll be 15.4?
$15 billion in it,
billion.
assuming no money is used, which is unbelievable amounts of money. And especially when a lot of that money, but we need to have a reserve.
So we can afford, the point is we can afford to be doing the transportation.
In my opinion, yes.
Then very interesting to me that where last time it was zero, this time there's $221 million to fill in the ditch where we cannot afford to honor our Texas Tomorrow Fund commitments. Talk about that. That's the first time we've had to dip into the savings account of sorts
That's correct.
To pay for these commitments we made to Texans when they signed up for this program.
You know, that original fund was closed back in 2003.
Right.
And in part, really the reality was the actuarial assumptions that were put up when the fund got created were really off. They
Right.
were off from the beginning.
Right.
And so therefore, the amount of cost going out was greater than the assumptions of how much money needed to come in.
Yeah.
And so my office, we have been investing that. That's one of the investments that we have because we run those programs. And essentially, we see that we're dwindling that cash reserve down in this current biennium.
Right.
It's the first time that we're going to have to essentially backstop that with tax revenues coming in.
So,
the Treasury.
so it's the actuarial tables not being exactly right when the plan was put into place, but I have to imagine also that another thing, 2003, is deregulated tuition. Probably the cost of higher ed has gone up enough that you're beginning to feel a little bit of that as well, right?
You do, but interestingly, we put out a budget drivers publication right before session, as we have the last couple sessions.
Yeah.
And one of those budget drivers is higher tuition in public education, in higher education. And interestingly, we point out in there, even though the snapshot is a little bit smaller, I think it's 96 to 03, tuition increases were slightly higher then, just barely, than they were after deregulation.
When regulated rather than deregulated.
Yeah,
Is that-
slightly.
Right.
But my point being
Right.
is, it was wrong from the beginning.
So the idea that the chancellors and the regents at these systems are running around like drunken sailors in the era of deregulated tuition is actually false. Although
well,
you hear that up the street
Well,
every
I
2
don't know,
years.
either that or they were drunk before they got even deregulated
Right.
tuition.
Don't
might
you
have been
talk that
both.
way about Brian McCall. Do not. He will probably be watching this. All right. So my question is, if it's 221 million,
Can we go
and-
back and take
Yeah.
that out? Because I just remembered my 13-year-old, my 10 and 10-year-old, I plan to send them to college. So
Well,
they may not
cross
get
Texas
admitted.
State off the list.
Now
right,
they got to
yeah.
go out of state.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's higher tuition. So the 221 million in this biennium becomes what in the next 2 years and the next and the next? What's the nut that you've got to find going forward, do you think? You've obviously projected this out.
To cover the expenses.
To cover the
that
expenses
they
associated
have
with the fund.
with the amount. Oh, for the
In other words,
overall fund.
if this is the amount that you have to dedicate for the Texas Tomorrow Fund, and this,
this biennium, we need the 200 plus million.
yeah, right.
But then through the course of the next two bienniums, you will see a slightly less amount. And if I recall, we're somewhere around $600 million is what we're going to have pay out of the Treasury.
so this is the high
This is
water
the
mark.
high, and then it slightly
Got
goes
it.
down. Even though some of those credits that people have bought for their children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, or friends, or whomever, some of these will last until 2030 or beyond.
Right.
But you're talking about small amounts of money.
Okay, so it's about 600 million or so in total
Yeah,
that you all are
that's
in the
right,
hole.
that's
So when you do the math, puts and takes, you get down to 119.12 billion, which is just under 9 billion more than last
Significant amount of money.
biennium. Are you hearing from people, Comptroller, that this is an optimistic revenue estimate, or are you hearing it's a cautious revenue estimate?
I have said the fact that it's a good amount of money, but I'm putting caution out there just because, again, as I said, and I think y'all have said it and others have continued to quote me, that this estimate doesn't start for September of this year.
Right.
And then it runs for 2 years. So
Right.
I want to provide caution out there because, again, we believe in the data that we just put out.
Right.
And looking at all the metrics, this we think is a very accurate revenue estimate.
Right.
However, with that being said, you don't know exactly what the economy is going to do.
Well, these days, God knows what's going to happen in 9 days.
right.
Right? Let alone 9 months. Who can predict 9 months? And then who can predict beyond that?
2 years after that.
I continue to wonder if this process of budgeting for 2 years makes any sense.
Well-
if you had a small business and you were trying to predict your expenses and trying to predict your revenues 2 years out in the volatile world environment that we're in right now, would you be able to run your business on that basis? I mean, is there any thought to not doing it that way?
Well, I think the only reason you're advocating that is you want them back more often.
Well, that's true. Selfishly, I would like them back more often. But in all seriousness, is this any way to run the 10th largest economy in the world?
if you look at it, the state has the ability during the interim, through the legislative budget process, the
Right.
LBB and the governor, they have the ability to move money around. They have the ability that if the economy goes down, They have the ability to tell agencies they need to reduce their spending.
Right.
So there's all types of levers.
So they're
that the
essentially
state
working the budget
has
in between.
That we continue to manage the budget until we come back.
Right, but you acknowledge you don't know what it's going to be like in September.
No, there's absolutely
no
no
way.
way.
Right.
We have, I mean, I've joked several times, it's as though the day before a legislative session, the guy behind the green curtain, the Wizard of Oz, gets to come out and I get to show my head and say, hey, this is the levers we've pulled and here's what we think.
Yeah.
And then the guy goes behind the curtain.
Well,
Now, I'm not going to show you where the curtain's at, but that's our secret.
Well, so speaking of that guy, you were on stage on Monday saying things that made me think this was actually an optimistic scenario. I mean, I'm no comptroller, but I listened to you and I listened to you talk about the volatility in the economy, and I actually wondered why the revenue estimate was so high. Here are some of the things that you yourself said were concerns for you on Monday. You mentioned the volatility of oil and gas.
Right.
Severance taxes, and of the oil and gas situation. Mr. Fainter looked it up for me this morning. The price of oil is back above 50 bucks.
Right.
It's not 26 bucks in January as it was a number of years ago when I interviewed
But
you.
it's not over $70.
But it's not
as
over
it
70
was
bucks.
just a few months ago.
Correct. So volatility of oil and gas. Volatility of sales taxes, and let's acknowledge, as you said yourself on Monday, that the sales tax volatility is less volatility than the oil and gas volatility.
By far.
By far. And the sales tax contribution to the overall economy is a much higher
That is right.
percentage than the oil and gas contribution. But you did show a chart in which the sales tax stuff does
That's right.
do a little bit of that.
And I'd pointed out,
Right.
as I've pointed out for the last 4 years, that in the last 20 years, it's gone down 5 times. And so
Right.
it does go down.
It does go down. So the
but it
volatility of
doesn't
oil and
have these
gas,
swings.
volatility of sales tax, the stock market, whether the stock market is or is not anything
Right.
more than
Right.
like the
Right.
sports book in Las Vegas. It may
right.
just be for entertainment purposes only, but it does have real world consequences.
That's right.
The stock market we've seen in the last couple of weeks has been enormously volatile.
Yes.
Interest rates are rising. You yourself said that on Monday. Trade policy remains unsettled, which is of material interest to Texas more than, say, Vermont, right?
Yes.
This is a big part of what we do. I wonder, you didn't say it, but I wondered on Monday about the immigration crackdown. Whether the border security conversation is going to have an effect on our labor market. We have had an extraordinarily good jobs picture in this state for some time. In fact,
Yeah.
I don't know that it's the case today, but there was some extraordinary number, 3-digit number of months in which the Texas job picture outpaced the very good national job
Yeah, that's
picture.
right. Historically, we have outpaced the national average.
And in
year
fact,
after
the
year.
unemployment rate, I think in November was 3.7%, which was
3.7%,
a historic low.
That's right.
In the history of Texas, it was a
right.
historic low. So I wonder whether the immigration crackdown at the border is going to somehow affect the free flow of labor. We know that ag, construction, hospitality all rely heavily on a labor force that in some respects pivots off of the degree to which the border is or is not available as a source of labor. I wonder about the economic impact of a wall or a barrier or steel slats, whatever it is. That's going to have potentially an impact on us. Have you done any analysis of what a wall would mean from a
No, and I'm not even going to dare try to ask Tom Curry to put those assumptions in.
Right, but I mean, it's
You know,
not. But it's not immaterial.
No, it's not immaterial. But I will say one that is even more certain but uncertain is the trade discussions. And so I get.
So you go
asked-
back to the post-NAFTA stuff and how that has the potential
asked
impact. That's right.
significantly because, again, coming back to trade,
Yeah.
Texas is the #1 importer-exporter out of all 50 states, $650 billion in value back and forth. It adds a $240+ billion to this state economy, a significant contribution.
Right.
And the point coming in, people have asked quite frequently, what does those discussions do to this economy? And we've consistently said that it tends to lead to a potential drag if the agreements are not renegotiated and put into place because we're an international economy. But with that, we don't know exactly. I've got numerous friends and businesses that are very dependent on trade in their own businesses, and they can't hardly figure out what it means to their bottom line and their supply chains. So you try to do the best you can in those assumptions, yet you don't want to sit
Right.
here and just make math up to make math
And,
up.
and the reality is that while the president has talked about we have this deal, this new U.S. Mexico Canada trade deal,
Right.
that's the successor to NAFTA. The
Right,
fact
right.
is, It's only on paper. Congress hasn't approved
That's
it.
right, that's
and
right.
based on how Congress can't seem to find its ass with a map and a flashlight lately, I'm not convinced anymore that this deal is going forward than anything, right?
No,
I mean,
and I said this on a panel discussion yesterday. The point is yes, we have a deal, but we don't have the details.
we
of
don't
the
have a deal.
and
Right.
we don't have Congress that has passed it.
Right.
And one point that one of the panelists made a comment yesterday that during the government shutdown, the federal workers on the trade agreements that are supposed to be putting all this together, they're not working.
They're furloughed.
So
Right.
this is delaying that
Right.
even further.
Can I ask you about, on the back on the question of border and the degree to which this is a factor, volatility and all that, the lieutenant governor who was not in Austin on opening day was in Washington. When he came back from Washington, put out a release saying, here's why I went to Washington. President called. I was working with him on immigration.
Right.
And he called out specifically what he said. This is from his release. Billions of dollars lost to Texas in illegal immigration in the area of education, healthcare, and law enforcement. Can you backstop that number? Is that accurate?
Well,
that we're
I
losing
get-
billions of dollars to illegal immigration?
I get asked all the time if we will put together some type of analysis on the impact of illegal immigration in the state of Texas. And it's always interesting to me that Republicans ask for me to do an analysis in one manner, Democrats ask me to do an analysis in another manner. And part of that is depend on what services they're using. And if you look at the fact we have roughly 1,100 more people in the state of Texas every single day,
Yep.
every single day. 570 of those are natural growth. 520 of those just basically are those that move into the state from migration. And then people ask, well, what percent is illegal? Well, the illegal was counted in that 520.
Yeah.
The Census Bureau doesn't really know which is which. And so the point is, we all know there's people that are in this state and in this country that are here without documentation and paperwork. And so are they in the public school system? Yeah, they are. And so I think
Are they
that's-
going to
that's-
county hospitals
and-
to be treated if they don't have
yeah,
coverage?
absolutely.
Sure.
Now,
right?
do I know exactly how much money that is? Have we done an analysis? No. Are there a lot of reports?
So
that
where's
are
so
out
where's
there
he
for
getting that number
assumptions?
from? If you don't know, how does he know? Where's he getting his numbers from?
I would assume there's a whole bunch of reports that he's looked at. But I have no idea.
that you don't have or you didn't produce?
I've been working on a revenue estimate.
Okay.
In case you haven't heard, we've
Okay.
been busy, Evan.
Okay. All right.
I don't have troves of staff that works on all these issues.
Well, the budget of his office must be bigger than the budget of your office, then, I guess. The biggest factor, though, Comptroller, that I thought about when I heard you give the revenue estimate on Monday and made me feel it was optimistic was that we are now in month 114 nationally of the current expansion,
Yeah.
which is the second longest in U.S. history, and in 6 months is going to be
The longest.
the longest in U.S. history. Aren't we overdue for some kind of slowdown, recession, something? Not that I'm wishing it
And-
on any of us.
No.
But aren't we overdue for it, and shouldn't we be planning for that?
Well, and there's a reason that I had stated all revenue estimates have some notations of caution
Right.
because you don't know what's going to happen. Yet this one, I highlighted more caution, as I
Right.
said, than ever before because of the reasons that you listed.
Yeah.
And I tell people in my speeches that when you're in the second longest economic recovery in modern history and about to be in the longest, hopefully, every morning you wake up, you're one day closer to the next recession.
Right.
Now, we don't know when that day is.
That's so
don't know when that
depressing.
is.
Listen to you. Like seriously, do not needle point that on a pillow, man. That is like the most depressing thing I've heard.
So, we took your optimism and
just-
we turned you to pessimism.
You turned my smile
But
upside
here,
down, right? Yeah. Well, so
I can tell you,
yeah,
now
yeah.
we can go back
Right.
and we can get some more optimism.
More kumbaya.
Welcome
so
to
your
our job every day.
So your exact
and
phrase
you wonder
on
why I
Monday.
ain't looking at immigration numbers. Hell, we've been busy, man.
You've already,
Really?
you got other things to worry about. Your exact phrase on Monday was continued but slowing growth of the Texas economy.
Yes.
And to your point, you called out three things specifically. Annual job growth in 2021 will be half of what it is expected to be in 2019. So that's one thing that you're projecting. Annual job growth will be half in 2021 of what it will be in 2019. The second thing is that the Texas economy measured by real GSP is expected to grow by 4% in 2019 fiscal year, but down to 2.3% in 2021. So again, roughly half by 2021.
Right.
And then the last thing is you're also projecting slower, lower personal income in 2021 versus 2018, 2019. So all the metrics or all the measures are heading in the wrong direction. Again, which is why I think this revenue estimate is so optimistic.
Those metrics and measures are continuing to grow, but they're not going to continue to grow at the boom that we've had in the last year.
Right, they're not negatives, but they're just slowing the growth.
They're slowing the growth.
But slowing the growth significantly in some cases, by 50% in some cases.
But you just can't continue to expect the economy is going to expand at what it's going to be. However, that's not going negative, that's going positive, which means we're still moving forward step by step, just not at the same rapid pace that we have for the last several months.
It's realistic as opposed to optimistic.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you the kind of
and
big...
as opposed to being too pessimistic.
The big existential question, has Donald Trump been good for the Texas economy?
Wow, man. Let's add all presidents into that fact.
I didn't ask you about all presidents. I asked you about this president. I'm asking you. We can go back and do Obama. We'll do Obama next. How about that?
You get to ask the questions you want. As a politician, I get to
pivot
and answer how I want.
Yeah, I bet. Yes. I've done this before.
Have you never had politicians up here before?
Yeah.
Have you never heard of the pivot?
Answer mine
Hell,
first,
I've been
then
in
you can
elected
answer
office
yours.
for 16 years. I'm getting good at the pivot, Evan, just as you are as the questions.
Of course, I would say to you, if it were an easy answer, you'd just answer it without all the smart aleck stuff. So,
yeah, well, if your questions were so good, you wouldn't be a smart aleck either. We're like two peas in a pod up here, I tell you. So we know each other well.
Stipulated. Come on. Has he been good? Has Donald Trump been good for the Texas economy?
I think yes. I mean, one of the things is that having a Republican majority here, and we can get into politics or not, but the fact is there's a lot of direct connections with the administration.
Yeah.
And with that being said, with the expenses, the important facts of the state of Texas, does Texas take a very different approach, in my opinion, from the state and leadership in the importance of trade agreements and what they mean to this state compared to the president? Yeah, there's a different tone and approach to that. But there are many other things that are aligned with this state.
He didn't like regulation. He didn't like regulation on business. We don't like regulation on business. So to the degree, for instance, that he has reduced the number of regulations on business, Texas probably thinks that's
so when looking
positive.
at the totality of all of it, and the fact is the state of Texas, yes, I mean, we're part of this nation. We will continue to be part of this nation as always. I mean, it's very important as Americans, but the fact is, Texas has an unbelievably strong economy, much stronger than everywhere else. So my point being, to some degree, whoever the president is, this economy is moving forward.
Regardless.
The policies that have been put into place in this state, regardless. Now, each president and administration can somehow impact this state, whether it, let's say, for example, whether it ends up being Medicaid, and what is our federal match when it comes to those issues we've been through with prior administrations, Obama and the Bush administration.
What about deficits? We heard a lot about how deficits were bad at the federal level until deficits all of a sudden were not bad. We have a ballooning federal deficit. Does that have any impact at all on this state or this state's economy?
As of right now, at this moment, not today, as long as the economy is growing. But at some point in time, when you're a country like many other nations, to where your population is declining and going backwards, how do you fill the jobs to continue to grow the economy? And so we've seen that around the world with many countries. And my point coming back around to, at that point in time, when you have this debt to pay, and you don't have enough economic activity to cover the debt that you have,
then it's a problem.
Then it has a real problem.
But not as of right now.
But not as of today.
Have you felt any impact of to ask you a more short-term, narrowly focused question, has the shutdown which is coming up upon later this week, the longest shutdown in the history of this country, has that had an economic impact on the state that you're able to acknowledge or measure or
as of today?
Quantify?
No, I do not think it's had an impact on this state. But if it continues to go longer, then at some point, it will start to have an impact. I mean, just yesterday, I was up in Killeen for a chamber speech at noon, and just right across the street is Fort Hood. And out of all of our military installations in the state, it has bigger economic impact than really all of them. And so therefore, the point being is, at some point when that furlough continues, when do you start having impacts to those families? From the paychecks? When do you start having an impact on that dreaded day that comes in April, when we all have tax day in April 15th? Do we have the employees in the Internal Revenue Service, which we all want to get rid of, but the reality is somebody's got to collect the money and send them over to the Treasury to pay the bills
and pay us our refunds.
And pay us our refunds. That's my point. So if they're not there, you begin to see some impacts to the state, to the citizens.
Well, and the fact is then the second tier is that if those people don't get paid, then small businesses don't benefit from those folks as customers, right? So
And I think the
stair-step
biggest
down.
question that we as citizens are going to see very, very direct in front is travel, those of us that travel through airports. And
Right.
at some point, those employees, those TSA employees, at some point, are they going to continue to work and go to work for free until they get their back pay? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Let me switch over to 86 legislative session and the issue that is at the top of the speakers, lieutenant governors, and governor's agenda.
Right.
School finance.
Yes.
We've been hearing about school finance as the top of the agenda item for many sessions.
Right.
This time they say, no, we're really serious. This is going to be our focus. The consequences of not getting it done are too great. We have to get it done. I understand you have something cooking out of your office. You've got an analysis of, or an overview, detailed overview of school finance that you're preparing, independent of what the LBB is doing, independent of what TEA is doing. What are you doing? Why are you doing it in semi-secret? What do you do?
If you knew about it, it's not so secret.
My sources are pretty
Blow
good.
that out. Yeah.
What are you doing? What are you
know.
hoping to accomplish? What do you think the effect will be? What do you want the effect to be? And when are we going to see what you're doing?
We'll put it out by the end of the month. I was hoping to have it out by the end of last calendar year, but unfortunately Glenn Hager continues to be in the editing process, which slows the process down,
Got it.
which is something that I've had asked my team to work on. And school finance, if you look at every issue that we deal with in the state of Texas, school finance is the most important one. It's the most costly one. And it is the one that brings as much or more, and I would say significantly more, opinions, criticisms, comments than any other issue. It impacts every Texan. And it's also that issue that essentially plagues not just Texas, but every other legislative body on how do we continue to fund public education?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that we stay within the confines of the Constitution and the court system? So it's the one that just everybody can't get over. And taking a step back and looking at the issue of school finance, we had the issues in the court cases for all these years about equity and adequacy, which means making sure that you have same taxability and revenues among the local school
Yep.
districts as well as the state match. And so you've had that fight over time, and that's pretty much settled, but then now the issue is very different than what it is. And one of the points is that no one envisioned when they put this thing together decades ago that Texas would grow at the rate we have. No one in this room envisioned what would be in downtown just 10 years ago,
Right.
much less 40 years ago. And so you have this kind of bickering going on among elected officials. Oh, if we're the state, it's your fault. If you're the locals, you're like, no, it's your fault. And to me, the basic math is the basic math.
Yeah, but why are you doing it? My
Well,
point is that the
because one-
comptroller is not obligated
If
to
you-
get into this.
That's right, but
right?
at some point in time, you got to figure out, what are we talking about? Apples, oranges, cherries? What are we talking about? And here's the point. If you look at the Legislative Budget Board, and they do great work, but they look at what is the state local cost share based on one metric. The TEA, they look at another metric. And so my point is, here's these different metrics, and as a former member, I'm confused as hell. Well, which share rate is it? And so try to have a document that says, all right, you use this one, you use this one. They're both right for some degree.
Yeah.
Here's a common metric, because we need to make sure that we understand where has the state been as a cost share? Where is it going? What is the trend line that we have? And if once you figure that out, then you can say, okay, how much is this going to cost? And this doesn't get into all the other issues that are out there, which are very real
So
issues.
you're
for
trying to be
public
you're trying to be an
reform.
honest broker, comptroller. That's it. You're
Here's
just
the
playing
data.
playing honest broker, no politics in it, and you're not going to be advocating on one side or the other of the conversation.
I'm not a policymaker.
So you
anymore.
won't say, we recommend out of the comptroller's office that for the future health of the economy of Texas, we need to invest X amount of money more, or just a non-specific amount of money more in public education. for instance.
But I am going to highlight some of the very real issues that are out there.
Right.
Let's say, for example, there's a lot of discussion about recapture.
Yeah.
And recapture was the state's effort after a couple of failed attempts through the court system to essentially put in place an ability to provide equity in the entire system overall.
Yeah.
Now, recapture in the last several years has gone up drastically.
Right.
But with that being said, This was the way to solve equity. And if we're going to limit recapture, then you're going to have to figure out at some point, how do you deal with the equity issue?
Did anybody ask you to do this?
No.
So you just woke up one day and said,
my staff.
I don't have enough to
probably
do.
wishes-
I want to take on this big flaming bag controversial issue just because.
Well, I was a legislator, as you said, for
Right.
12 years. And school finance is something that has always had an interest.
Yep.
However, the fact is, I never had the staff or the bandwidth to truly understand it.
And now you're going to do it.
And I've got a whole lot of staff now.
So the other half of this, the no one without the other conversation in this session is property tax reform. Now, I'm old enough to remember when you were a state senator running for comptroller and went before the Longview Tea Party in January of 2014 and said, quote, I don't like the property tax, never have. I think we should replace it. Do you still dislike the property tax?
I still don't like the property tax.
You would still get rid of it and change it out for some, I think you advocated for some kind of consumption tax at that time in place of it and got your ears boxed.
I didn't advocate for an actual solution to replace it. You know, I was running for an election. I just stated, I was just stating
I'm only
the problem,
about identifying
okay?
problems, not
Yeah,
actually coming up with solutions.
Come on, isn't that what elections are about? Elections are about identifying problems. The problem is when
So you
get
didn't
elected,
call
then
out
you got to find the solution.
You didn't call out the possibility of some modified sales tax as a replacement for property tax?
That got part of the discussion. If you remember, Deborah
Yeah.
Medina, who was in the election also, she was talking about property taxes, and she wanted to go to a.
But you were just hating on the
tax.
property tax. That was the limit of what you did.
Absolutely. But
Right.
I mean, here's the thing.
Right.
A property tax is grown significantly in the state, part of it because of the pressurization of the economic growth of this state.
Yeah.
And so as a result, every single year from year after year, no fault of your own, you have your house, you have your business, your storefront, and that economy is growing. You have a delta with your increased taxation that you've got to figure out how to pay.
Yep.
And you're just kind of continue to do your business. And so, I think that is a significant burden, whether you're a business or you're a homeowner.
So you think it needs to be, pardon me, it needs to be reformed?
But with that being said,
Yeah.
I have said numerous times in numerous speeches and interviews over the years that if you're not, there's no way fundamentally that you can truly eliminate every single piece of property tax in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
I mean, the numbers just, they don't add up.
So what about the idea, as has been proposed, was proposed unsuccessfully at the end of last session, Governor came back after the session and kind of doubled down on the idea of putting a limit on what local officials can do in the form of property tax increases without going to the voters. Do you believe in that?
I think that we need to have some type of limitation in property taxes as we go forward, but we also have to make sure that local elected officials,
Right.
all elected officials, they're elected by the public.
Well, that's
and they're
the-
accounted and they're accountable to the public.
That's
and
the
so
tension.
Therefore,
Right.
if the state of Texas, we need to make sure that, say for example, if you're talking about a county, say for example with healthcare cost,
Right.
you know, there's a good portion of their budget that is a mandate. If you go to the county jail, I mean, it's an amazing statistic. 25% in county jail are there because of some mental health
Mental
issue.
health, right.
Mental health issue.
Yep.
And so therefore, these are also state issues. And we need to have part of that bigger discussion that what are they doing with those dollars and what are the mandates
Yeah.
that the state is putting on them and or the federal government
Right.
in that leeway to give them the ability to deal with those very real issues that the state has said you got to deal with.
So you're sympathetic to the argument of some local officials, it sounds like, that there
absolutely.
already is an accountability measure in place if property taxes get out of whack, and they're called elections. If the local folks don't like the fact that local officials are raising property taxes beyond a certain threshold, they can just vote them out of office. That's the system we're in. That's the accountability.
They can, but also local governments are a creation of the state.
Right.
They
So
are
the
a
state
creation
has
of the
purview
state.
over this if they want
And
to.
they do. And
Right.
so, but I think it's healthy to have that
Right.
very transparent, open discussion about all the information that's out there.
The last time we reformed property taxes, or the time before that, or both times, my memory is that we went into all this trouble to reform property taxes, and then nobody really felt the relief. What is it going to take in the form of property tax for people back home to actually feel it? What's it going to cost us?
Well, if you look at the total of the property tax system of all local entities that
Right.
collect property taxes, if you live in a city, 50% of your tax bill is ISD. If you live in rural areas, 2/3 of your tax bill is ISD.
ISD, right, yeah.
54% on average across the state is what? ISD. And so I think if you really want to try to figure out how do you limit that property tax increase over time with valuation, you've got to focus on the school side. You have to pick a ratio. What is that ratio of local share,
Yeah.
state share? And the state is going to have to come up with a funding system that where you don't have the pressurization from the economy that keeps, because the system is local money first, state money second.
Right, so it's a seesaw, right?
It is.
So right
and
now,
as it
yeah.
goes up, and
Right.
several years ago, when it was reformed last time, rates were compressed, that seesaw went over. But the problem is, year one, it started
Yeah.
doing this again, and it will do it again. And
Yeah.
so to me, you've got to figure out, what is that share? Does it have to be 50-50? That's a lot of people's assumptions, but in the last several decades, it's been 40%.
So let's
on
talk
average.
about what 50-50 would mean. Chairman Huberty told me yesterday that right now, and I assume he knows because he's the expert at this, that the state share of funding of public education is 33%. That there's basically a $60 billion spend on public education at that 33% at the state level. If you go up to 50%,
That's right.
as you said,
That's right.
that is half again. You're talking about having to find $30 billion on the state side to go up to 50%.
To me, the solution is, how do you solve it going forward?
Yeah.
Then last time was, okay, let's rebalance it.
Right.
And I think most people would be happy with, if you can just prevent my property taxes from
Right.
going up in the future.
Yeah.
Now they want a tax cut.
Right.
But if you can solve it going future, progressively into the future, that's a much more realistic.
Right, but you understand,
opportunity.
Comptroller, that one of the problems here is that if you rebalance it and property taxes go down so that the state share goes up, and it ends up being a wash, and public education does not see more money, they just get it from the state as opposed to from property taxpayers, people are going to say this is not a solution. So in fact, you've got to look for more than that,
And
right?
that's part of the discussion that everybody's having, is this school finance and property tax reform, which one is it? And you're having that discussion. Is it
Right.
really to rebalance in property tax reform? Is it school finance reform? Which one is it?
Which is it?
Or is it a combination of both?
Quickly, are there loopholes in this next session when we're looking for money to put into public education and other things that we should be considering? Ross likes the high cost gas exemption. I like this question of the
He's for it or against it?
well, I asked him.
He just likes to talk about it.
I said which loopholes do you think are potentially on the table? And he said, I think that I'm interested in the question of the high cost gas. I'm interested in the question of commercial and industrial property appraisals and whether the comptroller's office, in doing its analysis of property taxes, believes that commercial and industrial appraisals are on the rolls at the proper rate and are therefore paying the proper share, because you hear at election time, especially in Democratic primaries, we are not taxing commercial and property owners sufficiently, and that's a bucket of money that we should be going after. I think of that as a tax increase on business, whether you like it or not. So are there any of those exemptions that we should be going after?
Boy, there's a whole pile of them out there. You know, we put a tax exemption exclusion report, and I was asked about this yesterday during an interview. Which one of these do you think that the legislature can go after, which is very similar to what you're just asking? And I just said, well, you know, it's really interesting to me that the first time my office was required to do this report, I didn't mention that I was actually still back in high school, by the way, and that was back in the 1980s. But why were we asked to put it together? So they would know what to look for and what to go after for school finance reform.
We're having the same conversation.
And we're having the same conversation.
Right.
And we've been publishing that report every 2 years, and they hadn't used anything out of it yet. So the point being is, if anything in there was really easy,
you would have already done it.
They would have already done it.
Yeah, I mean, you acknowledge that there are going to be many people who view the elimination of an exemption as a tax increase.
That's right.
Period,
That's
paragraph,
right.
that's it.
And you're right. I mean, I brought up the issue last legislative session. You're talking about equal and fair appraisal, and one of those is this dark store theory of, you know, this store is really going to go dark one day, so it really should be this valuation, not this valuation. And, you know, of course, the business community come unglued on it, and understandably so. And what do they see it as? Well, you're raising my taxation, and what do I have to do? I have to raise the price of what I am providing
on the end
and
user.
selling to the end user.
Right.
And so you added it up really there adequately.
So I brought a second prop for myself.
You're good at
which is this is the visual that the Comptroller's Office put out associated with the BRE on the Texas Legacy Fund idea, which you and I talked about over lunch more than a year ago, and it's got no more traction a year later.
We haven't been in session. What are you talking about?
Yeah, nice try.
We're up here talking about it.
But I'm actually very intrigued by this. And and the theory of the case here is that we have so much money in the ESF, so much more than we ever anticipated, as you say, that we're missing out on an opportunity to see a return on an investment. If we said we're going to accept the idea that there needs to be a floor below which the ESF cannot go, there is all this over and above money that we could be getting a better return on, that we could then be turning around and investing the proceeds of into education, other long-term challenges for the state. That's in essence what you're proposing here.
Yeah, that's it simply. The same things that my office is doing already with 14 different endowments. As I mentioned when I laid out the revenue estimate, and the one I've been talking about the most is the tobacco settlement funds. We were given those dollars. It's $1.6 billion. You could have wrote a check and sent it all and spent it all. Or the policymakers decided there 15 years ago, why don't we take that money, Controller's Office, we'll try to make a certain rate of return to keep the purchasing power over time the same, which is $2.4 billion today. The fund has 2.6, and we've distributed $1 billion over time. So essentially that money continues to use, and in another subset of years, we will surpass the amount of money that we would have spent originally that year.
So what is I mean, look, honestly, this to me seems like a no-duh idea. Why aren't people at the legislature jumping at the chance to have an extra $1 billion to invest over when they need that money to put into things that they don't have right now available to them?
A couple things. One is an education level that Glenn Hager's not picking up the morning paper and going, damn, I should invest in this. No, we have a whole team. This is what we do. We have a long track record. That's hurdle number one. Hurdle number two, which is bigger than any of them, is that, well, wait, if we do that, then we can't do this with the money.
But they're doing nothing with the money now. I mean, for God's sakes, it actually rained and they're not spending it.
You and I are on the exact same page on that, which that's the one where I go, okay, wait, you're not spending it, but you want to keep it just in case you want to spend it. That's why I continue to use the example. It's like taking the cash and burying it on the Capitol lawn. I mean, that's what we're doing. And especially when you look around the nation to other states that have severance tax collections, almost every one of them has done this. You know, that's when I say, my God, if Louisiana can figure this out, if West Virginia can figure this out, hell, Texans can do this.
Good.
Really?
All right, let's go to questions for the balance of our time. Put your hand up. Are we doing microphones, Charlie? How about over here first? We'll take as many questions as time permit before 9 o'clock. Please ask a question and don't make a speech. Thank you. Yes.
Well, first, I would like to thank you, Mr. Smith, Mr. Comptroller, and the Texas Tribune very kindly for organizing this informative.
That speech you can make all day. That's not. Go on.
An entertaining event.
Thank you. Good.
My name is Anthony Collier, and my question is, would a repeal of the driver responsibility program have a significant impact on expected revenue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one, I don't remember the data and the numbers offhand. It is a pretty good chunk of money that comes into the Treasury, and don't quote me on this number. I mean, I think it's like $600 million or more. I can't recall the number offhand, and y'all go tweet later, Glenn Hager was wrong, this is the real number. But anyway, with that being said, that is a program that really needs to pretty much go away. It's one that I am ashamed. When I was here in my first legislative session in '03, I voted for it.
I'm sorry Kerry Kamek left, actually, before he heard you say that.
I thought that was going to be a program that would fix the issue that every time you drive down the road, every fourth car you pass doesn't have insurance. You know, and this is a way to try to get theirs. But the reality is, you've got people that are trying to go to work who can't afford the fine that they have. And you know what? You're just having more people on the road that don't have the insurance and don't have a driver's license. And it's not a good program, and it substantially needs to be fixed. But that's my opinion. I don't have a vote.
Right. But that's a strong point of view. Take one here, and then we'll go to the back. Sir.
Steve Holsizer. I want to ask about the property tax issue. The franchise tax was to give property tax relief, which it did. But that didn't affect debt. And so local debt could go to whatever the local entities wanted to have that debt.
Right.
That backfilled a portion of the relief that was gained through the franchise tax. It also seemed like other taxing entities backfilled the rest of the benefit that was given from the franchise tax. I think that Evan said that at the end of the day, there was no tax relief to anyone because of these two, and there could have been other issues.
Or it didn't get felt by people.
How do you
right?
deal with those variables?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and one of the points that, you know, we'll point out in this report is what if tax rates gone up over time, and more ISDs than everybody else, and I think that's, again, the totality of all of those issues, and what are the unintended consequences of going in one direction, and does that have unintended consequences overall? Because each legislative session, it's very hard to pass another piece of legislation, and once it's put in motion, it's hard to back that up over time. So, I mean, the real issue is trying to have a totality of all the various issues that are out there and understanding so the legislature can actually make really valid, strong decisions on that. And one of the points I make is when it comes to school finance, whatever the legislature does, if they're going to use some other type of revenue or pay for school finance, the volatility in those streams of revenue is really critically important.
And let me ask you about that. The governor has now called out specifically in the last, well, he gave an interview to our Patrick Svitek a couple days ago, but it's not the first time he said it. He's talked about the idea of the possibility of diverting oil and gas severance taxes out of the rainy day fund and to some kind of education fund. You have called BS on this effectively, not on the governor specifically, but on the idea. You've said this is a terrible idea.
What I've said is if you're going to take that severance tax and just directly send it to public education or any essential function of state government year after year after year. I've been asked, well, if you don't use severance, what other tax stream would you use? And the simple answer is anything but that, because the volatility is so high.
Right.
Yet the governor and I had a conversation, which I think his answer was very much in line with that conversation. Last year, we were talking about this issue and several others. And I said, you know, but the point of the legacy fund concept is to take an extremely volatile revenue stream that goes up and down every year and by $1 billion.
Right.
And over time, turn it into a more reliable, stable stream.
Right.
And when I read that, I felt as though that was what he was saying. Is if you take part of it, but you got to do it in a manner that is reliable.
Well,
over time.
but Comptroller, he wasn't saying we should do the legacy fund concept.
No, I
and then-
understand that. I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that.
He
But
was
if you're
specifically
going-
saying simply divert those oil and gas severance taxes into an education fund. This is exactly what you said. It's not a very wise idea because of the extreme volatility in oil and gas severance taxes. Anything is more reliable than
That's
oil
correct.
and gas.
If you're going to take it and directly count on it year after
Right.
year after year. But if you're going to try to set it up in a manner to where you don't rely on the exact receipts every year, but you're trying to stabilize them over time for public education or anything else, that's a much more viable option than just directly funding straight out of severance tax.
Okay. Gentleman in the back. Hi.
One of the schemes that's proposed for providing local property tax relief is to lower the 10% valuation cap increase per year in the manner that California did many years ago. And
Where
Florida-
they can't go above.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's now 10%.
Right.
Florida has 5%, and I think California, you're not as long as you're in your home, it can't go up at all.
Yeah.
Doesn't that, in fact, socialize the taxes that would have been paid on that and force other property taxpayers to pay your fair share of taxation?
One of the things, biggest issues to answer this first, that is on residential, but that's not on business. And so that comes in the issue that we were talking about earlier, which valuation do you use? Because if residential has a 10% cap and businesses do not, which is a very valid issue. But then another valid issue is that, and what you're talking about is if you have this cap that your valuation may go up from a market value, but your taxation value is held way down here, you may never want to move. Why would you move? So therefore people that are in their home, they're never going to move because they don't want to start all over again.
Yeah.
And so those are some real issues that you got to figure out as you're going forward with this. So it sounds simple, well, let's just do this, but it ends up being very complex on how you deal with the unintended consequences. But the fact is this. At the beginning and the end of the day, with the rising valuations that we have in Texas and those tax rates, I mean, people, they're really getting to where they're extremely strained. And so how do you deal with that real issue too, with all these other ones that are variable? And that's why this has not been an easy solution the legislature's tried to deal with for 10 years now.
Yeah.
But at least this session, more than ever before, it is very refreshing to have the three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker speaking all in alignment that this is an issue that we want to address. I mean, that's extremely important. Now, whether they can get across that hill we'll see. But it is very nice that on essentially day one, day two, this is what we're working on.
Yeah.
And that's a positive effort.
Any more questions for the comp? Right here. Hi.
Hi. On the issue of property taxes and school funding, what do you think are the benefits of Chapter 313, and if specifically has it helped rural Texas?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at Chapter 313, which that's a chapter of the tax code, and essentially what it means is those projects that have high capital valuation in the state of Texas, whether it's manufacturing, there's a lot of wind, there's a lot of solar, some R&D projects, that essentially they go make an agreement with the local school district that those valuations would be held lower for 10 years before they enter the tax rolls. We collect all that data. All of it's supposed to come to us. The forms are supposed to come to us. We put out a report that either we just released or about to release on Chapter 313. And if you look over time, I'm trying to remember, I think since the creation of that program, there were supposed to be qualified jobs that were going to be created, a little over 10,000. There's been over 12,000 jobs that were created. Tax benefits over the duration of the program was about $10 billion in tax cuts to those entities. And I think the valuation on the ground was, oh my gosh, I'm trying to even remember what that number was. It was hundreds of billions of dollars of assets put on the ground. And so therefore, if you look at the math, it's created jobs. The valuation on the ground during the 10 years is higher than the tax benefit. So it has definitely created a lot of investment in the state of Texas, but as Chapter 313 is going to be reauthorized next session, because that's when it ends, and if the legislature doesn't do anything, it goes away, they need to look at, the question is the projects that qualify, do we still need all those projects to qualify today? You know, maybe it brought them before, but are they going to happen anyway? And that's a valid question that I think they really do need to look at. Do I think the program needs to continue to exist? Yeah, I think it's been a good program overall. But with that being said, you need to make sure that, do we really still need all these to qualify? Is there some that should qualify that don't today because technology changes, business practice changes, which is why it sunsets and you reevaluate it every so many years?
We take one or two more and then we'll wrap. Got one over there, sir?
Yes. Good morning. What is the projected sales tax revenue from the Wayfair case? Additional sales tax?
Yes. So in the revenue estimate, the numbers that Evan and I were talking about earlier, we have put into place rules, proposed rules that we plan to adopt under the authority we have that will go into effect in October of this year for that online remote seller collections. In the revenue estimate, we add in about $200 million a year that is in the estimate, yet there is a package of bills that the legislature, I think Senator Nelson has filed those, we'll ask the House to file those. I talked to Chairman Zerwas about it the other day, that deals with the marketplace. So in other words, a business that is not physically located in the state of Texas, has a nexus to Texas, it deals with that marketplace. They're not here, but it needs to be collected, and that would actually bring in another $300 million a year. That's not
Over and above the 200.
That's right. That is not in the revenue estimate, so it'd be another $600 million for the biennium. That is, if they pass it very close to exactly how we wrote it. When you substantially change it,
Right.
then that $300 million.
Well, and the
goes
fact
away.
is that the online sellers are going to lobby the crap out of that bill, aren't they?
Well, you know, the fact is a lot of them, several of the online sellers are actually already collecting. The big ones are. And so we're already collecting that even before the Wayfair decision because they knew this was coming.
They knew this was coming.
And so the biggest issue is trying to make sure that everybody else comes into play, but you got to do it in a manner that doesn't place an undue burden on those very small businesses.
I'm going to actually make an executive decision that it's 9 o'clock, and as much as I want to take questions from these two fine gentlemen, I'm going to give everybody the benefit of walking out of here at 9 back to their offices.
So you got 4 seconds till everybody.
So let me use the remaining 4 seconds to thank the comptroller for being here. Thank all of you for being here. We'll see you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Likewise.
As always.